If you take nothing away from this, this is it. Build shelter, not too big, mostly plants.
Those 7 simple words, though borrowed and modified from famed author Michael Pollan in more recent years, embody the ideology that has guided the Bay Area architecture firm Arkin Tilt for nearly 3 decades. Led by David Arkin and Anni Tilt, they decided early on to hang their hats on ecological design, mindfully adapting designs to be harmonious with the surrounding ecology and working with bio-based alternative construction systems like straw bale and rammed earth. And this was well before sustainable design had really caught on in the mainstream. So, what drew them to this relatively unpaved path? David believes it was just something innate in him since childhood.
I often note that I spent a good part of my high school and college years living in a tent. And so I think as a camp counselor. So I think a lot of our, connection to nature with the way we shape our buildings was a result of that experience. And I spent a lot of time building, bridges and towers out of rope and ironwood sticks. So maybe it goes way back to that. But I would also note that when I moved to California, I lived and worked a couple of years up at the Sea Ranch, apprenticing with Obie Bowman, and he was really a master not only of passive solar design and sensitive siting of buildings in an amazingly beautiful natural environment, but also utilizing wood primarily as a resource and large rocks and other natural materials. And so it really, came home for me through those couple years of work. And then in graduate school, started working with Sim van der Rijn. He was a California state architect under Jerry Brown's first tenure as governor and established the Office of Appropriate Technology. And together we were tagged to design the Real Goods Solar Living Center's new retail showroom, and had gone in with a design featuring very large curved rammed earth walls. And one of the people at Real Goods said, well, what if we built those walls out of straw bale? And even though Cimarai, none of us had either heard of straw bale, but we said, yeah, sure, why not? And that engaged our engineer, Bruce King, who may be a familiar name to you as well. He's done a lot of writing on straw building, earth, low carbon architecture, etc. And so through that experience, Bruce and my partner Anni Tilt and I were among the groups that founded the California Straw Building Association. And I think our relationship with natural materials really blossomed out of that work, the friendships created, and then a growing interest in what are these resources that are found often very locally, if not actually on a job site. How can they be used?
That's so fascinating. And then at what point did you start your own architecture firm?
It was almost immediately after that. I was commuting by ferry and bicycle from the East Bay to Sausalito. It took about an hour and a half each way because I was, crossing the bay twice in order to get there, which was good for planning the day, but not so good when our second child was born. And so it was really, and also I think we recognized that it was the early days of a growing movement in green building, both in energy efficiency and paying more careful attention to materials. And so it was just the right time to start our firm. That was 1997. So 27
Wow.
years.
And did you start out with the intention of that you were only going to do more kind of sustainable projects?
Yeah, we did. We decided that we were going to wear green on our sleeves, as we like to say, and came up with 5 very simple rules which still guide our practice to this day. And if I think carefully, I'll be able to come up with them. I think it's harmonize with the site is the first one. To build as little as possible. which I like to say is somewhat ironic for architects, but it's really not making spaces any larger than they need to be to meet those needs. Passive survivability, which is shaping the building in response to climate. Um, Resource efficiency and maximizing that. So, paying careful attention to materials, which is largely what we're talking about here today. And then finally, making designs that are beautiful and lyrical, and hope that others get excited and want to do the same.
Thinking back to your first project after you started your architecture firm, what was that? Was it a straw bale project
No,
or
it was a remodel of a 1950s ranch style home in here in the Bay Area, and we removed the ceiling framing and exposed all of the wood structure and skip sheathing that was hidden away in the attic. Added a layer of insulation on top of that. We added a little cupola at the ridge to bring in daylight and provide for natural ventilation. Had a madrone tree trunk with branches that reached up into that cupola. I know we used a number of salvage materials. I think it's the first time we used the recycled glass countertop material, now known as Vitrazzo. And the clients actually drank the soda water, and those bottles went into their countertops. So it was a good example of um, getting a lot of things that have become priorities of ours all the way through. I'd say another one that happened early on was a 28 square foot addition to a 700 square foot bungalow here in Berkeley. And we ended up cladding the exterior of it with license plates as shingles. And our client had a childhood friend who was a car dealer in North Carolina. So most of the plates are North Carolina dealer plates, but then they had to make sure all 50 states were represented. And the Wyoming plates with the cowboy, all the cowboys all have lipstick, so they're cowgirls. And it just went on. And I think we used a length of railroad track as a beam. And the city of Berkeley, started asking questions about it. And we had all the structural data on it, and they said finally they admitted they just wanted to make sure we hadn't picked it up next to the railroad track, which we didn't. We got it from a salvage yard, but
oh, that's funny. That actually, I read that you do quite a bit of design work building with repurposed or salvaged materials, and I was curious what kind of challenges are associated with that. Do you get a lot of questioning or having to comply with certain codes? Because I know with reusing certain materials, you just can't use them like structurally or things like that.
many places have actually adopted codes specifically for reused lumber that allows you to figure any old piece of wood as at least a number two. And this is specific to Douglas fir, which we use here on the West Coast, which is a reasonably safe assumption. Number two is a lower grade. There's number one and then select structural, which is, clean, beautiful wood. So, older wood coming out of buildings tends to be higher quality than the lumber we're getting today, and so it's a way of incentivizing reuse. So there's not a code restriction in that way. If I start looking at things like windows and doors, often what you can find in a salvage yard is going to be single glazed. Um, so it doesn't have the double or triple insulated glazing that we now use, none of the low E coatings for higher efficiency and solar heat gain control. So we'll often utilize those resources on interiors where we're not worried about, controlling conditioned space. You can add a safety film to door glass and achieve the required, safety rating. So there are methods of, utilizing these resources. I'd say if one is looking at larger structural elements, it's really important to identify what those resources are ahead of time. If you're wanting to use doors and windows, go find them first and then design the building to fit them. You know, you can always count on finding a 3 foot wide by 80-inch tall door. But beyond that, it's going to be harder to say, oh, I'm going to find a window that's exactly the size of my opening. You probably won't.
Aside from the license plates, are there any other really interesting salvaged materials that you've used on a project?
I would say a favorite one was we had a greenhouse that was part of a building, and we were using it for conditioned space and humidity. This was in the high desert, very dry climate, and we knew that it was going to need shading for the highest, hottest summer months, and so we proposed shade fins. And our contractor, actually, who was a world class glider pilot, suggested flaps and ailerons from old aircrafts. So I went to Faith's aircraft salvage in Sacramento and found all sorts of flaps and ailerons from Piper Cubs. And these were ridiculously affordable once they were deemed to be no longer airworthy. So that's what we used. That's a favorite example. We've done a lot of work with the railroad track, supporting photovoltaic arrays and utilizing ore cart wheels as part of the support structure. So, sort of building on that theme, planes, trains, and automobiles. We've used street signs for things. Another one, a middle school project, we knew we needed a clean, washable surface in the restrooms, and discovered that you can buy old billboard vinyl tarps. I think it's called billboardtarps.com. And so when they make these, giant billboards, they're only temporary. They print, whatever is on there. And for the middle school project, we ended up getting a tarp that was from Alvin and the Chipmunks. And so that's what we clad the lower half of the walls in the bathrooms with, for one example.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. So it seems like a part of the challenge is one, well, even coming up with what are some alternative materials we could use, but then two, where do we find them? And then three, do you have to find specialty contractors who are willing to work with these materials or know already how to use them?
Yeah, I wouldn't describe them as specialty contractors, but you hit the nail on the head when you said contractors who are willing. And usually it involves, a lot of conversation, building in allowances. We found is a good way, so that they can budget ahead of time for things that they just don't know. And then I would say we and our clients probably get more involved than most architects and owners in helping to find this stuff and bring it to the job site, and in some cases even work to get it installed. This is one of our earliest projects before the internet. Actually, one of our clients, who, unlike Al Gore, actually did help to build the internet. She was able to find all sorts of great resources. We in the Bay Area are blessed by having places like Urban Ore and Whole House Building Supply and others that are salvage yards where we can find these things. But frankly, these days, Craigslist, eBay, it's all out there and it's findable. And there's been more of a push, and I think I want to mention the AIA's materials pledge, which is a emerging program to promote climate health, ecosystem health, human health, social equity, and also circular economy, which is what we're currently discussing. And so there's a lot of interest, especially in the interior design world, in making resources findable and installing them in a way that they're reusable, that they just don't end up in the landfill any longer.
I'm glad you brought up the AIA material pledge, and that leads to another question is sometimes with some of these materials, when it comes to human health specifically, I suppose, um you may not always know the chemical content of some of the salvaged materials. Is that something that you guys have to consider when you're trying to find a salvaged material?
It is something we are paying attention to, and the suspicion is with any, I'm going back again to doors and windows, that you're probably dealing with lead paint, or even if you aren't, assume you are, and then removing it carefully and appropriately, or encapsulating it, becomes part of that program. But by and large, a lot of these resources, older ones especially, didn't have a lot of the toxic chemicals in them. They just are what they are. They're steel. They're wood, and so you know there's not a lot to be worried about. With newer materials, we're using the MSDS and the EPD. That's the material safety data sheet and the environmental product declarations to really discover not only what is in them, but also what was the embodied carbon impact of creating that
Yeah,
resource.
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too. Those are two really important tools to utilize. And kind of shifting gears more towards that, the carbon conversation, was that always a part of the consideration? Even back when you first started your firm, was it? It seems like carbon has really become more of part of the conversation now, or in more recent years. But that was that a consideration when you first started your
I would
firm?
say when we first started, it was more an aversion to waste, and whether that was wasted energy, in terms of creating an efficient envelope, or looking to utilize these salvage resources, or natural materials, which tended to be agricultural byproducts and things like that. So it wasn't first and foremost on our radar, but at some point, I think it was 1996, there was a article published about the end of cheap oil, and it was an awareness of the climate impacts of oil. And then at some point, we had the aha moment of, oh, plant-based materials, they store carbon through photosynthesis, and we need to use more of these. And that, knowing that, and it was through my re-engagement with the California Straw Building Association and 10 years as director, that really became one of our primary messages in why these resources are so important.
I recently tuned into a webinar that you gave about carbon, and you were talking about the full kind of life cycle impact of a material from the extraction through to the end of life. And I know that's something that a lot of designers and builders are starting to evaluate now. So I was curious, what should designers and specifiers be looking for as it relates to carbon?
I think that is the important question of the day. And as our buildings become lower energy users and can run on renewable energy, the upfront carbon impacts of the materials, and that's everything from the extraction and manufacturing of those materials to the transportation impacts of getting them to the building site. That's everything, and those impacts are immediate and there today. So I think the careful attention being paid to avoiding the heavy hitting carbon impact materials and using the best available options, lower Portland cement content concrete, or and using less, coming back to where we started the conversation, and then steel that's largely already recycled, but looking to steel sources that utilize renewable energy as part of the electric arc remanufacture of those products, and then looking to the bio-based alternatives that can offset the carbon impacts of those other materials. And one of the resources that I would recommend is the Carbon Smart Materials Palette. This was put together by Architecture 2030. It's materialspalette.org is the website for it, and it goes through both the currently popular heavy hitting materials and talks about the better alternatives within those, and then there's a whole other palette of these carbon smart alternatives. So that's just one of a few resources that are out there. I'd also mention, since we brought up the materials pledge, Mindful Materials is an organization that ties all five of those priorities together, but certainly ecosystem health and climate health hitting on this carbon.
Those are two great resources that really kind of help to take what can be such an overwhelming subject matter and kind of boil it down to where to get started, sort of.
And then I'm also participating in a North American bio-based materials collective, and it's looking to bring together the regional bodies like CASBA, the California Straw Building Association, and others who have been, tuned into local or regionally available resources, and also, helping to get them into the building codes and more popular usage. Communicating with building officials in various jurisdictions. So there is a whole movement underway to make it easier to be able to utilize these, lesser known resources.
Where do you see interior designers and interior architects fitting into the carbon impact equation? Like, well, what should they be thinking about?
Well, as we discuss, these bio-based resources in particular, insulation and interiors tend to be some of the best places where these can be utilized. It in many ways comes back to choosing finishes that, by their nature, do the job. And so I would say, together with architects, creating buildings that have interesting and good looking structure to the degree that one doesn't necessarily need to cover it up, that it is great. And whether, it's this tenant or that tenant, they might choose to just, hey, the ceiling's beautiful, we'll just leave it exposed. And then you're not putting up something and then taking it down and putting up something else the next time someone moves in. So I think that's a starting point. I think designers are leading the charge towards creating demountable finish systems, whether it's furniture or wall panels or things like that, that can be removed and reused, and then creating the databases, the resources where folks can find these things. And that's not only, saving carbon, but it's saving dollars as well.
Oh, that's fascinating. I hadn't heard about that. So, not to put you on the spot, but what are these demountable systems?
Well, I'm thinking of presentations I've seen, and representatives from Gensler, who does a lot of tenant improvement work. They're leading the way on creating this, circular economy where, one can find these resources, usually through salvage yards that are holding them, and making it known through cataloging on the internet, where you can find them.
So, a little bit more in the sounds like maybe a commercial setting versus residential. Like,
Primarily commercial, but I think that in the residential world, it's a much slower cycle of people changing out such things. I think being able to turn people on to the finds, the interesting things that they can find in a salvage yard, and that's part of our work, in that trying to make things that are interesting and lyrical and get people excited about cladding a wall with license plates.
yeah. And was just to jump back to that, was that just the exterior, or
In
did
that
that
case,
go
it
into?
was the exterior.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So I was curious, when you're building with straw bale, how does the interior look? I noticed that some of your projects you'll finish it with like a lime based plaster, or what? How do you finish the inside of that?
Traditionally, straw bales have been used stacked up like they did in Nebraska over 100 years ago as big fuzzy bricks, and then some form of plaster on the interior and exterior. We've been utilizing a post and beam system with eye joists, and then stacking the bales between those, and using a structural plaster on both sides, either a lime plaster, a cement stucco, or pisé, which is a gunite applied, a sprayed on version of rammed earth. However, more recently, we've evolved to utilizing hybrid systems with plywood framed walls, and stacking the bales vertically on end between them. And that allows us to use any type of cladding system on the plywood side, and then a clay plaster, a clay-based, earth-based plaster on the straw bale side, which again doesn't have to have the structural strength that a more cement or lime plaster, which is going to be more carbon intensive as a result of that, is. So I think we're looking at, how can we utilize these, lower strength cement things like clay, which don't require any processing, any heat and energy, and utilize those. And then we can use anything on the other side. On a recent project, and I kind of got this wall behind me maybe for this reason, but we did the plywood on the interior side and stacked the bales from the exterior. That gave us the improved fire resilience performance of the straw bale and clay plaster on the exterior. And then we just left the plywood as the interior finish.
Oh, okay. Wow. It seems like that's becoming a more kind of popular. I don't want to call it a trend, but a lot of people are liking that the natural feel of the wood.
Yeah, and I always, we always take care to balance. If you have a wood ceiling, maybe not having wood walls, or vice versa. It's good to have a lighter surface to, bounce daylight. But even structural plywood is interesting. Is the way we look at it. We've been utilizing now on a couple projects under construction BAMCore, which is a bamboo-based wall system, and it has a structural skin on the interior and the exterior that does all of the load bearing and lateral bracing, and then you can fill the inside with any insulation. There are no studs. So it breaks down, it removes the thermal transfer, through the wood framing. And you can now utilize the interior surface, which looks like, bamboo, as the finish on the interior. So we've been doing that with these new projects.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I was just going to ask you what kind of exciting new bio-based materials are you guys working with?
Yeah, so that would be one for sure. And then in that case, in these cases, these two projects were insulating the cavity with rice hulls, which is a byproduct of making growing rice. Let's see, we've used cork on a few projects. As an insulation material and as a finish material. We've used hemp wool and now the board version of hemp. Wood fiber board for insulation would be another one that I can think of that we've been using recently. On a farm worker housing project, we, instead of using gypsum board for the interior walls, there was a rice straw based medium density fiberboard MDF product that we were able to get and utilize for that finish. That factory is currently out of production. We're hoping it comes back into the production. They were really targeting, the IKEA like market, all the furniture and other products that are made out of MDF. It's a way of utilizing straw instead of wood as the raw material for that.
What do you like for flooring?
Well, on a few projects recently, we've used Adobe, which is a mixture of clay and chopped straw and sand. And then there's a group called Claylin, and they make a line of sealers specifically for earthen floors. So we apply that. It's a linseed oil base, but they've got some other things that make it, a hard, durable surface. Annie and I just moved into our back cottage, which we had recently renovated. It was a 1905 structure, but we put down a clay floor. And I'm now living daily on a clay floor, and in my bare feet, it feels great. I'm like grounding every day. We're big fans of wood, from salvaged resources to engineered wood flooring. Um, if it's a more public building, a concrete slab, and then we'll stain the slab with iron sulfate, which is a natural fertilizer material. for like rhododendrons and azaleas. And it says on the bag, be careful, this will stain concrete. And some, crazy fool natural builder started staining concrete with it, and it works great. It just reacts, and you get a rust color that can then be sealed.
Are there any other interior materials that your team really likes or that you work with a lot?
The clay plaster, we've also used clay paints, which again, the clay is hydroscopic, so it controls humidity and creates a healthy, comfortable indoor environment. Um, Again, kind of returning to let things be what they are. We like to expose structure. Again, the wall behind me is an example, but ceilings that are exposed beams or trusses and decking. So those types of natural materials. I mentioned Vitrazo, which is the recycled glass countertop product. Um, Various bamboo resources for casework and things like that. Salvaged woods, I'd say, is popular in our palette.
And I know that you did mention some resources already, and maybe these are the ones that you would say again. But for interior designers that and interior architects, how can they discover some of these alternative materials?
In addition to mindful materials and the carbon smart palette, um, you know, looking to the internet. And I would say be sure you're wearing your greenwash filter goggles, and take a critical look at the information you're finding. But it's out there. And, places to find. Again, regionally, understanding who are your local salvage yards and getting to know what they have. My rule had long been, if I'm there and I find something really cool, to buy it because it won't be there the next time. And after a little while, the garage started to show that, and so now we're a little more judicious about that. But a few favorite pieces, we hold on to, wait for the right opportunity.
I can relate to the garage thing. Kind of jumping back to the greenwashing, it can be challenging, especially when you're first getting into this, to really know what to look for. And for instance, on the surface, cork may look like an amazing material to use, but then you dig a little deeper and find that this particular company used some type of binder or backing that is chemical based, or maybe is not the best option. Are there certain things that are red flags that they can be on the lookout for?
Well, it's funny you mentioned cork, because at least in its insulation form, it is one of the safest and most sustainable resources, given that it's either coming off a tree that keeps living, or it's made from the waste from making corks. The wine corks are cylindrical, and there's actually quite a bit that gets end up left over. Um, but paying attention again to the material safety data sheets and the environmental product declarations, and really understanding what's in there. Asking, is there some simpler, lower carbon alternative that might be the thing to use? I find that the red list of chemicals to avoid from the Living Futures Institute is a great guide. And I think if you just simply, apply that as a filter, saying, I'm not going to use anything that has anything on this list in it, you're almost all the way there.
So I know we've talked a lot about different ways to kind of approach design more sustainably and perhaps reduce carbon impact. But if you had to boil it down, what would you say are just some of the key things that an interior designer or architect should think about?
Well, I could probably boil it down to 7 words, if I paraphrase Michael Pollan's food rules. And this is often I say, this is, if you take nothing away from this, this is it: build shelter, not too big, mostly plants.
I love it. That's that really does encapsulate everything. Keeps it simple too.
We had a California Straw Building Association with some partners had a booth at Greenbuild a couple years ago, and we asked people, you know, to tell us what is more green than a locally resourced agricultural byproduct, and we challenged them to come up with that, and most people said nothing, which was technically true. If you did nothing at all, that might be greener, but that they couldn't come up with anything. We got some funny answers. Folks said poop or ice, um, but we had three people who actually identified something greener, which would be to be building shelter using living things. So, like an espalier, apple wall or something, where the building itself is a growing plant. And I would say, yeah, that's the greenest thing. But after that, these plant-based resources are the place to go. And it's not just me or a handful of us saying that. The U.S. Department of Energy put out a call for advanced research projects for carbon storing materials, and they identified hemp and bamboo and straw in particular as the common building materials. And I love that they called them common building materials, as having the greatest potential to store carbon. And worldwide, we grow enough grain to take that straw and meet all of our building insulation needs worldwide. And if we did that, we would offset all of our transportation impacts. But also, just last year, the United Nations, in their global ABC path to building decarbonization, they, in a three-step process, the second step is a shift to bio-based materials. So know that this is not just a handful of us on the edge saying these things. This is, people recognizing that this is the future that sustains us.
I think it'll create more happy living environments too, because we are from nature, and there's that connection, like you said, with your clay flooring that you now ground yourself on every day.
I think that's the way we've lived has been with nature. Ideally, we continue and do that. So you're right. I think it touches us on some unconscious
I
level.
was just curious too, for like the average homeowner, maybe wanting to build new or add like an ADU or something, and they wanted to build with straw bale or even rammed earth. Is that something that they could easily approach on their own, or should they really work with someone like an architect who knows?
There is a chapter, and it's an appendix chapter in the International Residential Code, which is the code that's adopted by all US states. And some states, like California, for one, have fully adopted that appendix as part of our residential building code here that has prescriptive requirements for designing, simple straw bale buildings. So you don't need an architect, you don't need an engineer, you don't even need a contractor to follow those guidelines and do a straw bale addition on your house. Just to use that as an example, light straw clay is in there, and there are some other building materials that people aren't always thinking of, but now they're in the building code. So the guidelines are there. There is a website, strawbale.com, that has a number of simple building plans available for modest straw bale structures. Some of ours are there. So like the plan sets that one can buy from, an ubiquitous number of websites. There are plan sets for these more natural alternatives available now as well.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I was just so curious. And thank you so much for your time and sharing your insights on this. It was really
It's been a
amazing.
great pleasure. I always love to talk about these things. I think our planet is worth keeping under a 1.5 degree global temperature rise and livable. And so I invite everybody to, dig deeper into these planet saving resources.